Good to see you and very glad you could join us. I do hope you're taking advantage of the festive respite as we prepare for the new year. I'm hosting as always. A warm welcome to our new viewers. My name is Felicity Ezewike. Preparing for anything, not just a new year, is important. And it is for this reason we're jumping on today's commemoration of the International Day of Epidemic Preparedness. Just as life seems to be moving towards normalcy after over 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, a new variant of the virus, BF7, has emerged. Before COVID-19, we had the devastating Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014 through to 2015. According to WHO, annually, Africa faces an average of about 100 infectious disease outbreaks and other health emergencies. But weakness in national preparedness and a general lack of initial funding to investigate and control the outbreaks before they progress to epidemics remain a significant challenge. What is more disturbing is that the impact of any uncontained disease outbreak goes beyond the immediate health challenges. Now, the decision to declare December 27 as the International Day of Epidemic Preparedness is part of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and underscores the importance we must attach to raising awareness, exchanging information, scientific knowledge and best practices on epidemics at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Today's conversation is our contribution to the campaign. My guest is a professor of virology at Redeemers University in Nigeria. Oyewale Tomori was a virologist for the World Health Organization, WHO's Africa region, establishing the African Regional Polio Laboratory Network. He has vast experience in disease prevention and control and has authored and co-authored over 150 scientific publications on the subject, as well as other issues. He joins me now on one slot. Very glad for another chance to speak with you, Prof. Thanks for giving us your time.
It's my pleasure.
Let's begin with just clarifying the distinction and the connection between epidemic and pandemic, because the layman, personally, I used to mix them up until I had to do my background for this conversation.
Thank you very much. I think epidemic and pandemic is a matter of size. The number of people, the number of countries involved and all that. An epidemic can occur within a country, but a pandemic becomes an international thing. You can't have a pandemic in your country. You can have an epidemic, an outbreak on an epidemic. But then when it then spreads to other countries like COVID did, then you're talking of a pandemic, which is something that is global.
Yeah. Talking of the pandemic now, according to the WHO Regional Director for Africa, Dr. Moeti, the early models which predicted how COVID-19 would lead to massive number of cases in Africa were largely the work of institutions not from the continent. And she stressed the importance of anchoring any analysis on Africa's epidemics firmly within the continent. If you could speak on this, do you agree first off, and how important is it for us to anchor any analysis of epidemic or pandemics within the African continent?
I think the WHO Director General is very correct in that. Let's put it this way. Diseases vary from country to country. And there are different conditions which make whether it's going to be an epidemic, what age group is going to be affected, what group of people. So it varies from one country to another. So you cannot use the model in Europe and use it for our own in any part of, even for within the African region. Each country must still do a model of its own. For example, let's look at COVID, for example. COVID, by its nature, affects mainly elderly people, 60 years, 50 years and above, who also have other kind of diseases, what they call comorbidity. Then take the population dynamics in Africa. You find the larger proportion of the African people are young people, not elderly people, compared to what is happening in Europe. So the epidemic in Europe would definitely be different from the one in Africa or in any of the African countries where the population, the dynamics differs. And that's why you have so many more people dying in Europe compared to Africa. And I think we made a bit of a mistake because initially everybody, whether in Europe or whatever, we were all ignorant of what COVID was. Even the WHO kept changing its own advice based as soon as we get more information about what it is. So when COVID started, nobody knew what we were all dealing with. Very few people had proper knowledge about it. Unfortunately, we in Africa, we're waiting for them to decide for us. Why in actual fact, we should have been looking at our own epidemiology, our own situation, so that take a decision, our response should have been based on that, not on what Europe is telling us. And I think that was the point Tedros was making, where he said, look at your own environment. Who are the people affected? What age group are affected? Is it the same as what is happening in Britain, for example, or in America, or in China? And therefore, target your response based on that information. And I think this is where we in Africa fail. We're waiting for the world to tell us what to do. And then, we were just lucky that the disease did not ravage us as much as it ravaged people in Europe.
Yeah,
otherwise, they predict.
Yeah, so those two clarifications were very important, because the whole idea of one slot is for us to look inwards and look for African solutions to our unique problem. However you look at it, though, the COVID-19 did push African leaders to listen better, to advise about preparing for future epidemics and pandemic. What I'd like to find out from you is, what are some of the actions that they have taken so far that inspires some confidence on the march towards enhancing Africa's preparedness to tackle any form of outbreak?
I wish I could be as optimistic as you are. I don't think we performed well in Africa. Let's be frank with ourselves. There were, governments took action in the face of the crisis that occurred. It was what we call a knee-jerk reaction in many African countries. We came up and it wasn't that we didn't know that we had epidemics. It wasn't that we didn't know how to prepare for epidemics. But I think in most of the African countries, what we have is we easily forget the lessons that we learned from previous epidemics. You just mentioned Ebola came 2014 to 2016 or thereabout. Ebola runs almost every day or every week in DR Congo. Yet, when each epidemic comes, it's like we are starting from afresh, because we have not learned from or we've forgotten the lessons that we learned from the previous one. In many African countries, remember when the COVID came, I think what was said was, Africa had only a few laboratories that could do the diagnosis of Ebola, of COVID. Yet these were countries that set up laboratories all over. When Ebola came, what happened to those laboratories? What did we do with them? Why would a country like my country, who have only 3 laboratories to do diagnosis of COVID, what were we doing in all the 60 years of our independence? So when you make sure that, say that our leaders are, I don't believe our leaders.
Well, there are some actions.
Let the next epidemic come.
Okay.
So just a second, let the next epidemic come. We will be back to where we are, because we easily have forgotten what is this we learned.
That would be a sad a narrative of the efforts because from the layman's perspective, yes, we tend to follow some of the directions that the European countries are taking, but there has been some comments as to some action. South Africa, for instance, is said to be making some good effort in creating, in vaccine packaging maybe, or producing medical supplies locally. So I know we still have a long way to go, but are there any actions so far during the space of these 3 years that inspires some, no matter how minute, some optimism as to what the future of our efforts in fighting future pandemic would look like?
Felicity, we were talking about Africa, and then you pick South Africa. South Africa is not Africa. It's just one country out of the 54 other countries in Africa. So if our discussion is about Africa, we can give, South Africa tried well, one other country, but generally Africa did not try. That's what I'm trying to make. So let's clear that from the beginning. You can pick out a few oases in the desert of our incompetence, but does not mean that represents the whole of Africa. I think we need to get that clear. Yes, South Africa did great things. We're quite, we know they've been doing great things. This is not the first time. a few other countries, maybe the northern colleagues up in Tunisia, but sub-Saharan Africa, like you and I know, let's be frank with ourselves, we did not do well.
The regional body, the Africa CDC, was elevated by the AU in the course of this pandemic, I believe, I'm not sure now, you can help us confirm, to be an autonomous body that can make certain decisions as it affects, fighting diseases in Africa. Do you think that is a step, as to, making an effort to improve our situation? And will that enthusiastic, if I may use that word, move to give the Africa CDC that autonomy it needs, a good way to start?
Thank you very much. Before African CDC, there was WHO African region. So we're looking for a place to deal with diseases. We already had one in a place. African Center for Disease Control did very well. But let me ask you one little question. How much of Africa's money is in African CDC? Even in AU itself, how much of Africa's money is in AU? It is not enough to keep talking about, we want to do this without committing yourself to it. Africa has words, and political will is mere word. What we are lacking in Africa is political commitment. Since when AU started, and I ask you the question, how much of Africa's money is in African CDC? It's less than 30%. Even AU itself, the money that it uses to run itself is less than 30%. When you are depending on foreign sources to do what your program is, you cannot achieve what you want to achieve. It's going to be achieved based on who is donating the money to you. Africa needs to move away from saying, I want to do this, but to do it. Again, I keep asking the question. African Center for Disease Control did fantastically well during this epidemic, but where did the resources come from? Did they come from Africa? No. That's the message I think we need to get across to our leaders. It's not just talking in Addis Ababa. Do something with the resources that we have.
So what can we do? What can we do? If you are commending the work that the Africa CDC did, and you also say that we have the WHO regional bodies that will help with the crisis, what can we do to improve on the work that the Africa CDC has done? Or do you think it's a duplication and we should focus on one? If funding is an issue, for instance, how can the African Union, the African leaders, come together and decide on a way to properly fund the CDC, if that is your suggestion, or to focus on improving what the WHO is doing at the regional level?
We need both of them.
Okay.
They have different activities they are doing. WHO is much closer to the countries. WHO works directly with the government. And that's a plus on the side of WHO. African CDC seem to be more trusted by outsiders when they give money. And therefore they get all the funding. So the two of them must work together. It's not separate bodies that this is. You ask the question, what do we need? Africa must put this money where its mouth is. It's not sitting down in Addis Ababa and making resolutions. Put money into those resolutions and get it working. How many resolutions have we had about epidemics in Africa? They will number more than 15 or so of them. Which African countries signed to? As soon as they sign to it, that's the end of the story. Put money in there. Epidemics are always around. Preparedness is a continuous thing. It's a sustainable thing. It's not just sitting down at a meeting and then say, I do it, and then you don't do anything about it. Come back 5 years later and repeat the same thing you have said. That is the problem with Africa. And don't ask me Africa is poor. We're not poor. We're not. We're just misusing the money we have. That's the problem.
So I was going to wait towards the end of this conversation to ask you about leadership in Africa, because there is no conversation we have about development that we cannot, it's intrinsically linked with any conversation on growth. So if we have a problem with leadership, is there something, because the whole idea of this conversation is solution, is there something we can do to, let me use the local parlance word, ginger our leaders to be more proactive and committed to efforts to prepare for pandemics and disease outbreak?
Programs like this are very useful. But please, when you invite people to come and talk, let them be able to tell us the truth. Not people who give you fancy words and say, yeah, Africa is doing well, Africa is doing well, deceiving our leaders. Let's tell the truth to our leaders. The many more of people like us who tell the truth to our leaders, tell them they're not doing well. How will you, recently, when will Biden call 49 African countries to come and solve African problems in Washington? Why will Macron call African leaders to Paris to come and solve the problem of where your people are migrating and leaving your country? Why should African leaders not be the ones to sit down and say, why are my people leaving? Why do you have to wait for Macron to do that? Those are the points we're saying. We need to solve our problem, and we have it. Why do I need to wait? All the things you're talking about, African development, is all your bilateral agreement. Europe comes, G1 signs with Ghana, G1 signs with that, and then everybody is going in different directions. We are still tied to our colonial aprons, and these are some of the issues that we need to figure. Africa needs to come out and do what this is. We have the resources. Our problem is misusing, poor leadership, and we need to get our leaders, keep talking to them to let them know that they cannot begin to continue to do what they're doing. There are a few African leaders, maybe one or two, that are doing great things, but the rest are not.
Let's talk about these African leaders that are doing great things when it comes to investing and making efforts to improve our preparedness. Talk about one of them. Let's see, maybe there's something they're doing that we can learn from.
We keep using South Africa. They put a lot of money into their research, into their science. South Africa is probably one of the few countries that is fully funding its vaccination program. South Africa has its own problems without all this, but we're focusing on disease epidemics. In terms of disease epidemic, South Africa is a fantastic example. Go back, way back, they started producing vaccines locally quite a long time ago, not today, because their government took a decision that our people will take care of the vaccines for our people, and we're not going to just pour the money in and keep buying vaccines from everybody. We must produce vaccines ourselves. That's a country that is active, and that's what we need. Remember during the epidemic of COVID, they were one of the few that came up with the variants immediately and announced it. That's because that government has supported science and research.
So it ties basically to what you've advocated already, that African leaders must invest their money where their mouth is and take responsibility. We'll continue to shout. Hopefully, they will listen. In fact, they don't have a choice. They must listen to what we're talking about. Let's move a little and still try to explore the conversation as best as we can. Let's talk surveillance. In May this year, you wrote about Nigeria's response to the endemic monkeypox in parts of the country. One of your worries was that surveillance isn't what it should be. My question is, how important is surveillance in any efforts to arrest viruses, to contain their spread before it becomes something everybody's shouting about?
Surveillance is the eternal vigilance against epidemics. You can't take a holiday away from surveillance. Surveillance is an everyday activity. Unfortunately, unlike what governments are looking for, when you invest in something, they want something they can tax, something they can get returns on. Surveillance is not like that. The result of surveillance only comes after, if you fail in your surveillance, then you know what you are missing. Take an example, if you don't do proper surveillance, one epidemic, just like COVID did, is enough to destroy all you have built. So we must begin to see surveillance in that light, in the light of the fact that prevention, they say, is better than cure. Surveillance is prevention. Surveillance is alerting me of what the problem is. If I don't know what was done before and something new comes, I won't know what I can compare. That's why our surveillance must be consistent, must be permanent, must be all the time. There's no holiday from surveillance. And one other important thing, surveillance should not be centralized, should not be at the headquarters in Abuja or whatever headquarters, the capital of that country is. Surveillance must be broken down to the level, and it must involve the community, because it is the individual that gets sick first, and therefore they must be participating in those things. Until we make our surveillance community involved, we are going to continue to miss out on all that is going to happen. So surveillance is super important, is the number one. And you cannot have a holiday out of surveillance. It must be something you do on a regular basis. So if you're looking for money or tax from surveillance, forget it. You will pay the death of not doing surveillance when COVID comes and destroys all the epidemic, all the structures you have built up.
Yeah, the importance of community surveillance has been, reiterated by experts like yourself, but it seems there doesn't seem to be a commitment to improving a community-focused led responses. While we try to think about that and how we can deal with it, what would be your suggestion as to how we should go about carrying out community-led efforts to, surveillance, detecting early, and what should be the process?
Okay. The first message to the people is that it is not the government that controls the epidemic. It's me. Because if I keep myself from getting infected or I stop myself from transmitting to somebody else, then we can stop that epidemic where it started from. So the most important person in epidemic control is not the government, it's me, the individual. But governments have arrogated to themselves that thing that we are controlling epidemic. They don't. And therefore we must get that message down to the most important person in disease epidemic in control is the individual. And that individual makes up the community. And so when I get interested, that, look, this is my life we are dealing with. If I get sick, I won't, then I will do something to protect my life. Get your people involved to know that they are the most important point. I keep saying, no epidemic will finish any government. The epidemic cannot destroy a government. Others will follow. But the epidemic, a disease can kill me. It can kill the other person. But the government will always find somebody to replace it. So let's put the right focus where it belongs. It's the people. Get the message out to them. To them now, they say, look, you are the most important aspect of this. Without you getting infected, we cannot have a single case cannot become an outbreak. An outbreak cannot become a pandemic. A pandemic cannot become an epidemic cannot become a pandemic. So when you start it from beginning and you nip it in the bud, get the community involved. Let them be the one that in the cases. When those first cases occur, they have a system where they can go down the line. They may not be able to handle it immediately, but you get the information. And those who need to act can act immediately. So let's get our government to put the community in the position where it belongs. Let government stop arrogating to itself that they are the ones controlling epidemic. It is the people who control epidemic. My behavior and what you do. When you say wear mask and I refuse to wear it and I spread the disease among some people. When you say don't go to a community where there are so many people coming together without wearing your mask and I do that, then those are the things, those are the important people that we should be focusing on. That message must go down to who is the more important person in disease control.
Communication is something that's repeatedly coming up. What you're saying is the importance of effective and enhanced communication at the local level, and then the channel goes up. Okay, let's look at financing. Funding is always an issue. Recently, the World Bank approved $18 million additional financing to what they say strengthen ongoing regional disease surveillance and epidemic preparedness in West Africa. That is just one aspect of the conversation. What more can you tell us about the required funding to escalate these surveillance at the community level?
You know, the issue of financing, we all keep shouting. Africa said 2001, you must put 20% or whatever, 50% for health and all those kind of things. First of all, I asked the question, how did they arrive at 15% in 2001? That's the first question. And then education comes and asks for 10%, another one asks for 5%. By the time you add up all the percentage, it's already more than 100%. So let's be realistic about what is going on. Achieve the 15%. But the problem is not even the achieving that. You can allocate what money. What do you do with the money? Of the 18 million that whatever it is that you said World Bank has given, how much of it actually goes into that kind of thing? How much goes into other pipelines which have nothing to do with their decision? My country came up with 500, I can't know how many billions, which they said they were going to use for COVID. Go and find out how much exactly went into COVID, how much went to other things which are not completely related to COVID. In fact, one of the CSOs in Nigeria has taken my government to court and said, look, explain to us how you spend the 500 billion. That's the crux of the matter. It's not the amount of money you allocate. It is what you do with the money. And that's where we are failing in Africa.
Accountability.
Yeah, accountability, you got it. You took the word out of my mouth. Until we get down to that level, you can put in 5 naira or 5 whatever amount of money, and then I spend it well. And you can give 100 naira to somebody who squanders it. The impact of the 5 naira is better. So let's look at that aspect. We keep talking about government funding. I mean, government is not funding well. There's no doubt about that. But again, like you said, if there's accountability and we spend our money well, the right amount of money will go into this thing. I mean, you know what is happening with what the EFCC and other people, how much they are collecting from money that are stolen. Stories about oil being sent out of this country. All those are the factors. If we cut all that money into the right place, we will not be begging anybody for anything. We will not be borrowing money from World Bank. We will not be borrowing money all over the world and using 100% of our GDP to come and pay to service debt. Those are the issues that we should be looking at. How do we spend the money? How do we account for what we get?
Leadership.
What will happen with that money?
I'm trying to summarize what we've gotten so far. Leadership, communication, community-focused led initiatives and surveillance, and most importantly, accountability for fundings that we get. If we use them properly, we would get the right results. That's on the one side. There are other issues around this. We'll continue to push the conversation forward. One way to tackle current and future health threats, according to experts, is adequate universal health coverage. How can we strengthen this while investing in building needed infrastructure, plus juggling funding, again, for equity? We'll explore this after this short break. Stay with us. Very glad you chose to remain with us for the concluding part of this conversation. Universal health coverage, that is one way to address some of the issues we're talking about. But currently, Africa remains the continent with the lowest universal health coverage, with only 43%, if I'm correct, of its population achieving effective coverage of health services. Professor Tomori, how can we expand and create health coverage that will cover all if we are to help fight?
First of all, let me say that universal health coverage is not a one action thing.
Okay.
It's a marathon. It's a long journey. Okay. And we have to be consistent in our support for universal health coverage. Number 2, universal health coverage does not include only health. There are other aspects which you must also look into. Let me give an example. If you provide good water system for your people, you reduce the incidence of waterborne diseases. But under the production, maybe it's the Ministry of Water Resources does that. That's still part of health. So when we're looking at universal health coverage, we must look at every aspect of the human side that concerns health. Like I've mentioned, good water supply. I'm talking about the kind of research we're doing. We're talking about other issues like, what kind of diseases are spreading around your place. How do you prevent them? These issues, these are the things that we need to look at and take the universal health in what they call the One Health approach. We must also look at the environment. What damage are we doing in the environment that is causing health hazard? You are exploring oil in my country, and then you are spilling oil into the area, and you are affecting the health of the people. You are increasing the rate of cancer. Those are the things we need to look at. It's a basket.
It's a holistic.
Holistic approach to universal health.
Yeah.
What you can call it universal holistic approach, if you like to use the word.
Yes, indeed.
But that's what direction we need to go.
Yeah, I did say at the beginning of this program that uncontained disease outbreak goes beyond the health challenges, and you've just validated that submission earlier. It's a big, a broad area, as you've said, and if we focus on that, we probably wouldn't touch on other aspects of the conversation. So let's fast forward a bit and go to vaccination. Of the experience that we had from COVID-19. One thing that was prominent and that everybody condemned was the vaccine discrimination. And of course, we heard that it took the U.S. a long time to make the decision to give WHO the technologies with which they use to make the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, the advice for African countries is that they must adapt to improve the ability to produce vaccines. You don't seem to have a lot of optimism about our efforts so far. But if you were to advise, how should Africa begin to direct its steps towards creating the kind of technology that will help us to explore new ways to create vaccine rather than waiting for the European countries to give us a lead as to what to do?
Let me shock you a little bit. One of Africa's problems is trying to depend on equity to solve its problem. There's no equity in the world. There will never be equity in the world. Go back to the Bible. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. You love yourself first before you love your neighbor. It didn't say love your neighbor as more than yourself. So Africa must get out of the attitude that, oh, equity, equity. There's no equity in the world. Let's not deceive ourselves. And all the other countries that have gotten where they are, India and others, they fought for equity, begged for it, they didn't plead for it, they didn't whine for it. You must contribute to the equity table to get anything out of any equity. And that's the situation. Let me give you one good example. When Britain decided that those of us from Africa who were using COVID shield that was coming from India, that couldn't come into Britain, you are regarded as if you are not being vaccinated. What did we do? Ramaphosa and others came up and started calling Britain, oh no, there's no equity in the world, there's no this and that, all those kind of things. What did India do? India calls the foreign office of UK and says, look, I have COVID shield. You have COVID, whatever your own is. If you don't take my COVID shield, I don't take your own. And that was the end of the story. Immediately, Britain capitulated. We need to learn a lesson from that. It is not begging and begging and begging, and that's what it is. That's how we put our money into where it is. And it's not that Africa was producing vaccine before. There are countries like Senegal, even South Africa, that are producing some vaccines. Why can't we have one and which there was an African vaccine manufacturing initiative which came up with the idea that, look, instead of every African country producing vaccine, let Senegal produce yellow fever, South Africa produce X virus, the other one produce, and all of us would buy from it so that we can sustain it. That was the idea. But then when the COVID came, all that one was turned upside down. Why? Because each are different countries have a colonial masters to lead them. So they come in and sign bilateral agreement with you and break up all the African solidarity. That's the Africa must certify itself, must abide by this thing. We must not depend on what our colonial masters are still telling us. So AU, like I said, if 70% of your money is coming to AU or coming from outside, well, what can you talk about? So back to this, there have been efforts. When WHO, and then let me say one more thing so that before when we are accusing the overseas people of what they call it, hoarding vaccines, let me ask a question. When those vaccines started coming out, 1, 2, 3, who knew which one was going to work? Nobody. So sensible countries took a gamble and bought all the 3. Luckily for them, it worked. But they have a responsibility to their people. That's the first thing we need to do in Africa. And so asking them to give you the vaccine, and I ask the question, let's reverse the situation. Suppose it was all of us that were dying in Africa, and it was Africa that had the vaccine, and Europe, only few were dying. Will Africa give the vaccine out to Europe? No. So we know what to do. Put your money where your mouth is. We were producing vaccines, but build on those ones. Don't depend on equity. Go out there and fight for the equity with the resources that you have, so that you can go to the equity table and negotiate. If you bring raw material to the equity table, you get a raw deal. If you bring nothing to the equity table, you get no deal at all. Africa must wake up and put our money and say, vaccine production is not it's a commercial thing. So forget about whether there's politics or something. If you have your money, and it's economy, it's a matter of economy. If you have your money and you can give it to the people who have this, they will give it to you. They're only looking for money. What they are protecting is not the whatever it is they're making. It is the money they're going to lose that they're protecting. So if you have the money to buy, you buy. And then remember, there was a time when they said they were selling vaccines to us at a much higher rate than they were selling to Europe. Why not? It's pure economics. European Union got together and said they're going to buy 600 million doses. So are you going to, then Africa comes and individually we're going there 1 million, half a million. If you and I go to the market and I'm going to buy 200 yams and you will buy 1 yam, will they sell it to you at the same at the same price? No. So let's be honest with ourselves on this issue. Many times in Africa we keep talking and begging about this about equity. There's no equity in the world. It's a commercial world, so you must fight it like that one. India was like us before. They are not in that place. Singapore was in the situation that was in Africa. They are no longer there. Even Malaysia, Indonesia was in our position. They are no longer there. What did they do? They went on and built their own things and became what they have became. They can now go out and contribute something and say, if you have this, I have that. India did it, overcome the issue. So what's our problem?
If only we can sum up the courage and, audacity. There is nothing we cannot achieve, like you've rightly said. I'm thinking of a comeback to, your submission on equity. It's imperative we get our acts right. But I want to come in on, there's something you talked about. You talked about at a point, there was delegation. This country will focus on getting this vaccine done. This country will, Senegal, South Africa, and all of that. Yeah. Is that something to explore as a continent instead of focusing? And South Africa, you commended them at least for the efforts that they've put in, in preparing for the unforeseen. How can African leaders delegate pending when such an outbreak will come? Because it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So delegation, how can we better explore that so we are not held hostage when the time comes?
The first thing is, like you said, get the audacity, get the courage to say we're going to do that. It wasn't that we don't have people thinking in Africa. That, when I mentioned the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, this was something like about 10 years ago when this idea came up. But there it ends because we're not committed to it. We had the idea, we don't have the money. And I keep saying it's not that we're poor in Africa. It is because we're not using our money well. We're squandering our money, we're putting it into the European banks, instead of using it to solve our own problem. And that's what got us to where we are. So back to your question. You have to make up your mind one day and determine enough of this nonsense is enough. Enough of this disgrace and whatever you call it, iniquity. Until you get that little shame to put pride in yourself, we're never going to get to that level. Our leaders must go to. Are they happy going to Washington to go and hear Biden talk to them? Are they happy going to have Macron sit them down like school children and start telling them what they should do? If they don't have pride in themselves, then there's no hope for us in that way. There must be that pride that I cannot continue. Macron doesn't have two heads. Biden doesn't have two heads. We are equally as intelligent if we sit down and do what needs to be done. If you make up our mind right from the beginning to say, look, enough is enough for this nonsense that is going on in other parts of the world. On African listen, Africa must get up to do his own thing. Let me leave you with one final example, which I think where Africa. You remember when I can't remember which of the companies wanted to come and build vaccine production in South Africa with Aspen company, and they were supposed to produce the vaccine for the European market. And Ramaphosa called up and said, no, we cannot have that done, so no problem. So they started producing this for Africa, in Aspen in South Africa. A few months ago, Aspen said they were going to close up. Why? Because not a single dose of what was produced has been ordered by any African government.
Wow.
And so, these are the message of what was Africa's reaction. Africa now come around and say, oh, Gabi, come and help us buy this vaccine from Aspen so that you donate it back to us. That we're not ready yet. That's the problem. At that point, why did African countries not go to buy? They were waiting for COVAX. They were waiting for donation. Why didn't they use their money to go and buy those things? The 500 billion or whatever it is, which I said in Nigeria, where did we go to? Why are we waiting for donation from any other country? Why are we not buying our own vaccine? These are the issues. What are we doing with the money? So until we make up our mind to spend our money properly, to determine and say, look, have pride in ourselves, have pride in as human beings, and we will continue to suffer the indignity that we're suffering under equity.
Okay, let's look at our growing population and connection with any effort we are making towards preparing for the unforeseen outbreak in the future. Overpopulation and epidemic preparedness, how can we work with our population. Would you subscribe to suggestion that we need to invest a little more in the girl-child education and women empowerment as a way to manage this growing population so we don't get overwhelmed?
Yeah, I will give you a good example of I grew up in a family where my father is not just polygamous, he was multigamous. His number of wives were about 15, 16, 17. The number of children, about 40-something, 50-something. Nobody told me what to do. Why am I following my father's footsteps and go and marry many wives? Even the one I have, it took me so much to get them proper education or something of that nature. We need to grow out of all those cultural things. There's some things good in our culture, but there are other things which are not. We need to identify, and that's what on those good ones of it, we build back better on those ones. On the areas where, for example, population becomes, we don't want to talk about population now. Why? Because go back to my village, it's God that gives children. No, you don't want to curb God from giving your children. The other religions will not even want to talk about using contraceptive, those other kind of things. The countries that have advanced have also managed their population. I didn't use the word control. The countries that have advanced have managed their population. And the reason why Africa will not succeed with SDG is because even if we build all these schools, take the issue of how many children are out of school, say 10 million are out of school in Nigeria, and then you say reduce it so that only 5 million are out in another 3 years. So you build schools that will take 5 million, but then you have 15 million more children. How are you going to meet SDG? The two must go together. No, you can build all the schools, but it doesn't match the number because we are looking at numbers of people out of school. If 5 million were out of school and you managed to get 2 million into school, which you have reached, but then you added 700 more million children to it, many more will still be out of school, even though you have built enough schools to take the number. So we need to bring all that together. With that, the universal health care you are talking about, the fewer the people you have to take care of, the more your resources, even in your own home. I mean, the kind of education you send your children to will also determine, determine the number of children you have, determine how much of resources you have, what level of education you train them. My father probably trained us, maybe, I don't know how many, what level he trained us to, because there were so many who were being built for his farm. Things have changed. We need to move forward and look at the issue of religious leaders, cultural people must look at that issue. When God said, go and replenish the earth, he didn't say go and dominate earth with your population. He only said it to the animals. He said, let them multiply, But he said for Africa, he said replenish the earth. Well, you only replenish what is missing. You look at your population. You don't just keep on building on and on and on. I think we need to be very careful. We need to take all that together. Our population is very important. We need to get all that in, and then be able to plan for the population. How many countries actually in Africa know their real population? How many? We've been trying to do census in Nigeria since 1950. We're not agreed on any figure. So how are you planning when you don't even know what number you have? Those are the issues that are on ground.
Okay, I want you to connect this as well to climate change. You alluded to it earlier when we started the conversation, but there are real concerns about how climate change and growing population is impacting on efforts to mitigate any kind of outbreak. So what would be your submission on climate change and our efforts?
I think, again, I use the word One Health. One Health involves the pathogen, it involves the people, it involves the plant, and it involves the environment. That's what One Health is all about. Takes the incorporation, what is the temperature, what vectors are flying, all those kind of things. When the rain comes and I block the street and then there's flood in my place, does it increase diarrhea disease, and all those kind of that they come together. So climate change becomes an important aspect for us to look at. And how do they affect? For example, people talk about, the rising temperature will probably increase the number of vectors, make them more population, and then they can spread the pathogens. It also means that there's more, because of the temperature and the drought and other things, people move from where they are, invade the forest, expose themselves to the new diseases among the animals in the forest, and then a new thing comes out.
Prof, I need to interject because the director has just told me we have just about 2 minutes, and it's important for me to get your final thoughts. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I know we're not done with the conversation, but I must say that up front. I want your final comments, though, on what we must ponder collectively as a people as we look for ways to enhance epidemic intelligence gathering, surveillance, and outbreak response in Africa.
Africa has the talent. Africa has the resources. Africa has the people to solve her pandemic problems. All we need to do is to get our acts right together. I believe, there's a lot of intelligent people in Africa who can solve our problem for us. When our people go out there, it's the environment, the same individual, they go to excel there because the environment makes them prepare. African leaders must increase the environment for their researchers, for their scientists to excel.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Prof, for speaking with us today on One Slot.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There are many insights from today's conversation with the professor. One is the place and urgency of quality leadership, partnerships, and community-focused surveillance efforts if we are to manage epidemic before, during, and after. Another thing is that we must meet the continuing health system challenges and avoid similar fate in future epidemics that we experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic. African countries must take bold actions to repair our health systems and make them more resilient. I will repeat the importance of leadership and taking the lead when it comes to looking for solutions for our problems. It is all very clear that Africa's future socio-economic development will be shaped by how well we prepare to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to current and future epidemics or whatever outbreak that may come in the future. As always, I believe we can if we put in the work. Thank you very much for giving us your time. Until I see you next time, please be well.